The CEO sat behind his large desk, staring out the window at the bustling city below. Life had always been predictable for him, controlled and secure, with every detail in place. But one memory haunted him, the day a young woman in her late 20s had suddenly disappeared from his life without a trace. He'd barely known her, only interacting with her a few times, but there was something about her presence that had struck him. Her quiet strength, the way she held herself, even when she seemed out of place among the high-powered executives. She had worked for him in his office for several months, and their brief conversations were always respectful, but there was something in her eyes, a hint of something unspoken. He'd never questioned it until one fateful day when she vanished. No explanation. No warning. One day, she was there, and the next, she was gone. At first, he thought she might have taken another job or simply left for personal reasons. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, his curiosity began to shift into something more unsettling. Where had she gone? What happened to her? Had he somehow missed something? And then there were the children. 5 years later, when the CEO was visiting an old friend's charity event, he was introduced to a pair of young children, two lively, energetic kids who reminded him of someone. The way their eyes sparkled and their smile, it felt so familiar. As he looked closer, it hit him. These were her children. He hadn't seen her in 5 years, and yet, in these children, he saw a reflection of the woman he could never forget. How had they ended up here? How had they come into his life so unexpectedly? The shock ran through him like a cold wave. His thoughts raced, the questions piling up one after the other. Why had she kept them hidden? Why hadn't she told him about them? His mind churned with confusion and disbelief. He had to know the truth. But would the answers bring peace, or would they only open new wounds? The mystery had only begun, and the journey to unravel it would lead him to a deeper understanding of love, regret, and the secrets people kept to protect those they cared about. As he stared at the children, he couldn't help but wonder if this was fate's way of offering him a second chance to understand the woman who had slipped away so quietly, and a chance to finally uncover the truth behind her disappearance. The question remained, was he prepared for the answers he was about to receive? As the CEO left the charity event, his mind was in a whirlwind. The children's faces lingered in his thoughts, their familiar features haunting him. The moment he'd laid eyes on them, something deep within him had stirred. He couldn't deny it any longer. These children were hers. The woman who had vanished without a word, leaving nothing but unanswered questions and a trail of confusion, had left him with something more than just an empty space in his office. She had left him with children, her children. Driving back to his office, the CEO found himself replaying his brief encounters with her. He had been busy, too busy, with the company, and she had always been a quiet, unobtrusive part of his team. Her professionalism had impressed him, but she was distant. He had never bothered to probe deeper. Her personal life seemed to be hers alone, and he had respected that. At the time, he didn't realize how much her quiet strength had captivated him, nor how much he would later regret not getting to know her better. The first time they had spoken, she had seemed distracted, but that was typical, everyone was in a rush in his world. But there was something about her that always made him feel like she was carrying a heavy burden. He had brushed it off as something personal, something that didn't concern him. After all, she was just another employee, and he had enough to manage. But now, looking back, he realized that her quiet demeanor had always been hiding something much deeper. As the CEO sat at his desk that evening, he began to dig into her past. He accessed her records, work history, personal files, and found little. But there were gaps. Personal references had been removed, and certain details had been left unexplained. She had been careful, very careful. She'd erased all traces of her life outside the company. It was as if she had been living under an assumed name. The more he uncovered, the more he understood that this was no ordinary disappearance. The woman had planned it meticulously. She had gone to great lengths to vanish, hiding herself and her children away from the world. The CEO's chest tightened with guilt. How had he not seen the signs? How had he allowed her to slip away without ever asking the right questions? He realized how little he had known about the woman behind the professionalism. Her story was beginning to unfold, and with each revelation, the CEO felt his sense of regret deepen. He learned that she had been pregnant when she left, that she had never shared this with anyone, not even with him. She had been alone, carrying the weight of a decision she had made in silence. A decision that, no matter how much he wished otherwise, had been made without him. The thought of her doing this alone, without ever reaching out to him, stung him deeply. He had always assumed she was just another employee, but she had been so much more than that. She had been a woman with a hidden life, one that she had fought to protect. The CEO realized that this wasn't just about missing a piece of the puzzle, it was about missing an entire person. He couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to leave so suddenly, and what secrets she had kept hidden for so long. But the most pressing question still lingered in his mind: why hadn't she told him? Why had she hidden their children from him? He didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear: he couldn't ignore the connection he now felt, a connection that went beyond business or mere curiosity. He had to find her, and he had to learn the truth. The journey to understand the woman who had disappeared without a trace was just beginning. The CEO didn't know it yet, but this search would be the start of a life-changing revelation, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, family, and the choices people make when they are pushed to their limits. The days that followed were filled with restless nights and unsettling thoughts for the CEO. Every moment he spent going through the woman's past brought more questions than answers. He had uncovered pieces of her life she had hidden away: her pregnancy, her decision to leave the city, and her efforts to create a new life. But there was still one thing that remained untouched: the reason behind her sudden disappearance and her decision to raise their children in secret. The more the CEO thought about it, the more he felt the pull to understand. This wasn't just about the children anymore, it was about the woman herself. He realized that in his own busy, self-centered world, he had never once considered how his actions, or inaction, had affected her life. Her life after disappearing was not one he had imagined. She had gone far from the city, far from the high-powered life he had lived. She had found a small, quiet town in the mountains, where no one knew her, where she could finally breathe without the suffocating pressure of the past. The CEO couldn't help but picture her, alone, pregnant, and with nowhere to turn. In a small town, she had started over, working at a local diner, living in a modest house, doing everything she could to keep her secret hidden. She hadn't wanted to burden anyone, not even her closest friends. And in that town, she gave birth to 2 children. 2 beautiful, healthy children who had never known their father, never known the world she had left behind. Her life was a quiet one, difficult at times, but with moments of joy. The children grew quickly, and she poured all her love into them, shielding them from the outside world, from the secrets she kept. But the weight of her decisions never lifted. It never got easier. She had chosen to disappear not just to protect herself, but to protect them. For 5 years, she lived a life of solitude, with only her children and a few trusted friends who knew the truth. She kept her past buried, even as the world around her moved on. The CEO's company, his empire, had expanded, but for her, time had stopped. There was no room for the man she had left behind, no space for old relationships, no place for the life she had once known. The more the CEO uncovered, the more he felt an aching guilt. He could see the woman's struggle in every decision she had made. She had left him behind without a word, and he had thought it was just another passing employee, another face in the crowd. He hadn't realized how much of an impact she had on his life until now, when everything was falling apart. As he continued to uncover more about her life in that small town, he felt a deeper sense of loss, not just for the woman, but for the children who had been born from a secret he had never known. He had never been there for her, and now, he wasn't sure if he could be there for them. Yet, the more he learned, the more he realized that the children were the key. They were the missing piece. They had brought him closer to the truth, closer to understanding why she had done what she did. But the hardest part was yet to come. How would he confront her? How would he apologize for the years of silence, for the mistakes he had made, and the choices he hadn't seen until it was too late? And more importantly, would she even allow him to make amends for all that had been lost? The journey was far from over, but now the CEO was no longer searching for answers to satisfy his curiosity. He was searching for a chance to make things right, for a chance to understand the woman he had never truly known, and the children he never knew he had. As the CEO sat in his office late one evening, the weight of his thoughts grew heavier. He had been spending hours, days even, poring over the details of her life, her struggles, her quiet existence far from the bustling world he lived in. The more he learned, the more he realized how little he had truly seen. The woman he had once employed, the woman who had quietly slipped out of his life, was so much more than just another name on his staff roster. She had been carrying burdens no one had known, no one had seen, not even him. He couldn't stop thinking about the children. There was something about them, something undeniable that connected them to him, even if the logic didn't align. The way they looked at him when they met, their wide eyes full of curiosity and recognition, sent a chill down his spine. They weren't just some random children. They were hers, but they were also part of him. There was a bond, an unspoken connection that he couldn't shake off. It felt like he had missed so much of their lives, like an entire chapter he had never read. The realization hit him hard, he hadn't just let her go. He had let go of a family. A family he had never known, a family he never even knew he wanted. But there was more to it. It wasn't just the children that pulled at his heart. There was something else, something deeper. As he reflected on his brief moments with her, the conversations they had shared, the way she had always been just out of reach, the CEO began to see patterns. She had been distant, yes, but that was just her way. She hadn't wanted to get close to him because she knew the risks. She had seen through him, understood him in ways that he never gave her credit for. She had seen the pressure he was under, the loneliness masked by success, the emptiness hidden behind his work. In her quiet strength, she had recognized that he wasn't the man he appeared to be, he was a man searching for meaning. But unlike him, she had never had the luxury of pretending. She had known what it meant to fight for survival, to make the hardest decisions alone. Now, as the CEO sat in the stillness of his office, he realized just how much he had misjudged her. She hadn't left him because she didn't care. She had left because she cared too much. She had done what she thought was best for her children, for the life they deserved, away from the chaotic, impersonal world he inhabited. And yet, in doing so, she had kept herself and her children hidden away, and in turn, had hidden a part of herself from him. This discovery was a bitter pill. The CEO had always prided himself on knowing the ins and outs of his business, understanding the motives of those around him. But this woman, this mother, had eluded him. She had made choices with such strength, such selflessness, that he could hardly comprehend them. The deeper he dug, the more the truth about her and their children became clearer. He learned that she had made the decision to raise them on her own, away from the world that could potentially harm them. The CEO couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of guilt. How had he missed this? How had he not seen the woman who had been right under his nose all this time? And yet, as much as he understood her reasons, there was still a question that gnawed at him: why had she never told him? He had been willing to help. Hadn't he? They could have faced this together. Couldn't they have? But no. She had chosen to carry this burden alone. And now, 5 years later, he was left to pick up the pieces, to try and make sense of a situation he hadn't been prepared for. But there was no turning back. The children were part of his life now, whether he was ready for it or not. He had to find her. He had to understand her choices. And maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fix what had been broken, to build something new, something real, with the family he never knew he had. The bond between him and the children wasn't just a simple twist of fate. It was an opportunity, an opening to heal the wounds of the past, to learn about a part of himself he had never understood. But would she even want to see him again? Would she even allow him the chance to make things right? His heart ached with unanswered questions. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. It would be filled with more revelations, more difficult conversations. But he couldn't turn away. Not anymore. The CEO's heart raced as he stood outside the small house, the weight of his emotions heavy in his chest. He had never imagined this moment would come. He had spent years thinking about the woman who had disappeared from his life, wondering why she left, why she never reached out. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, a stranger in many ways, facing the children she had kept hidden away for 5 long years. The door opened slowly, and there she was. The woman he had once known, though now she seemed like a distant memory. Her hair was different, shorter, and there were faint lines around her eyes that spoke of years of struggle and sacrifice. But despite the changes, she still carried herself with the same quiet strength that had once captivated him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a silence that hung in the air, heavy with years of unanswered questions. The CEO opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say to her after all this time? How could he explain the guilt and the confusion that had been building inside him for so long? Finally, she broke the silence. "I never thought you'd come," she said, her voice steady but soft, as if she had already come to terms with everything. "I didn't think you wanted to know." He shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never stopped thinking about you. About what happened." His words felt inadequate, hollow even, but they were all he could manage. She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. The children stood behind her, peeking curiously at the man who had entered their lives so unexpectedly. They were the image of innocence, yet their presence added an emotional weight to the moment. The CEO could see it in their eyes, their quiet recognition of him, and the unanswered questions they carried. "Come inside," she said finally, stepping aside to allow him in. As he entered, the CEO couldn't help but notice the warmth of the home. It was small, modest, but there was a sense of comfort here, something he hadn't realized he needed until now. The children were playing in the corner, giggling as they made a mess with their toys. The woman sat down at the kitchen table, her hands clasped together, her eyes never leaving the CEO's face. The moment felt like a lifetime, and he could feel the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking about this day for so long," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "Wondering what happened, why you left. And more than that, I've been wondering about them." He gestured to the children, who were still watching him with wide, curious eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her expression softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I couldn't," she whispered. "It wasn't just about me. It was about them. I wanted to protect them, from everything. From you, from the world I knew, from all the things that I couldn't change." The CEO's chest tightened as he realized the depth of her sacrifice. "I would have helped," he said, his voice cracking. "I would have been there. You didn't have to do this alone." She looked away, her gaze distant. "You had your own life, your own world. I didn't want to drag you into mine. I thought it would be better this way." Her voice faltered slightly as she spoke. "I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know how to tell you that I was carrying your children." The words hit him like a ton of bricks. He had heard her say them, but it took a moment for the full weight of the revelation to sink in. His children. His own flesh and blood. He had been so consumed with his career, so wrapped up in his own world, that he hadn't even known they existed until now. The room seemed to close in around him as the reality of the situation overwhelmed him. He had been given the chance to be a father, but he had missed it, missed the first 5 years of his children's lives. There was a deep ache in his chest, a mix of regret and disbelief, but there was also something else, something he hadn't expected. The children, his children, were looking at him now, not with suspicion, but with the same curiosity they had shown when they first met him. One of them, a little boy no older than 5, toddled up to him and extended a small hand. "Are you, my daddy?" he asked, his voice innocent, untainted by the world around him. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The CEO felt his heart swell with emotions he couldn't fully comprehend. How could he answer that? How could he explain to a child that he had been too blind to see the truth until now? Instead, he knelt down to their level, his eyes meeting the boy's. "I think I'm your daddy," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm so sorry it took me this long to find you." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she watched the exchange. It was clear now, she had made the right decision for her children. She had protected them from a world they didn't need to know, a world that had been far too complicated. But now, there was a chance to heal, a chance to build something new. As the CEO looked at the woman, he knew this was just the beginning. There was so much more to say, so many more things to be done. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope, hope that he could make things right, that he could finally be the father he should have been from the start. The CEO sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped together, his gaze flickering between the woman he once barely noticed and the 2 children who were undeniably his. A lifetime of questions burned in his mind, but none of them seemed to matter now, not in the face of the quiet, unspoken truth that sat between them. His children. The weight of that reality pressed down on him, heavier than any business deal, any financial crisis, any problem he had faced in his career. These were real lives, his children, flesh and blood, who had grown up without him. And she, the woman he had known but never truly understood, had carried this burden alone for 5 long years. Silence hung between them, thick and uneasy. The children, sensing the tension, had gone back to their toys, their laughter filling the small house, oblivious to the storm brewing inside the adults. Finally, he broke the silence. His voice was low, careful. "Why?" She looked down, inhaling deeply, as if steadying herself. "Because I had no choice." The CEO shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You had a choice. You could have told me. You could have." She lifted her gaze, and he saw it then, the exhaustion, the pain, the years of struggle etched into her face. "And what would you have done?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Would you have left your company, your entire life, to raise 2 children you never wanted?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. She nodded, as if she had expected his silence. "That's why I didn't tell you." Her words cut deeper than he expected. Had he truly been so blind? So consumed by his work that she believed, knew, he wouldn't have wanted them? She sighed, rubbing her temples before looking at him again. "You were always so focused on your empire, on the next deal, the next move. I knew if I told you, you'd feel obligated. You would have helped, yes, but not because you wanted to. And I couldn't do that to them. I couldn't let them grow up feeling like they were just another responsibility you had to manage." His stomach twisted. Had he really given off that impression? "I would have done the right thing," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. She gave him a sad smile. "The right thing for you, maybe. But not for them." His gaze dropped to the floor. He wanted to argue, to say she had been wrong, that he would have wanted them, would have been there for them. But deep down, he wasn't sure. 5 years ago, he was a different man. He was cold, distant, married to his work. If she had told him then, would he have dropped everything? Would he have embraced fatherhood? No. The truth was staring him in the face, and it hurt. She saw the flicker of realization in his eyes and softened. I wasn't trying to punish you, she said gently. I was trying to protect them. And maybe, in some way, I was trying to protect myself too. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. So what now? He asked, his voice quieter. She hesitated, glancing at the children, who were still lost in their play. I don't know. The vulnerability in her voice struck him. For the first time, she didn't seem like the strong, composed woman he remembered. She looked tired. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of carrying the weight of this secret alone. The CEO felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't about the past or what could have been. It was about them, his children, her, all of them. I want to know them, he said, his voice steady now. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I need to be in their lives. I need to be their father. Her lips pressed together, her eyes searching his face. Are you sure? She asked softly. He nodded. More than I've ever been sure of anything in my life. She held his gaze for a long moment, as if testing his resolve, looking for any sign of hesitation. And when she found none, something in her eyes softened. I don't know how this works, she admitted. I don't know if they'll understand, or if they'll even want this. Then we figure it out together, he said. For them. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time since he arrived, she let out a small, weary sigh. Okay. Just one word. But it was enough. The CEO felt something lift from his chest. The journey wasn't over. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. A second chance. And this time, he wouldn't waste it. The CEO had spent his life making calculated decisions, controlling outcomes, and minimizing risks. But this was uncharted territory. He wasn't negotiating a deal, wasn't signing contracts, wasn't sitting in a boardroom. He was standing in a small home, looking at two children who barely knew him, at a woman who had carried a burden he had been blind to. And for the first time in his life, he didn't have all the answers. The days that followed were filled with cautious steps. The woman, their mother, was hesitant but didn't shut him out. She allowed him to visit, to sit with the children, to answer their curious questions in the simplest ways he could. The first time his daughter, the younger of the two, crawled into his lap, his breath caught in his throat. She had no concept of the years he had missed, no understanding of the regret that tore through him every time he looked at them. She only knew that he was there. That he was warm, and solid, and safe. And that was enough. He watched as their mother, her, moved through her daily routine, the ease with which she cared for them, the patience in her voice. She had built this life from nothing. She had sacrificed comfort, security, and even her own happiness to protect them. And he had not been part of it. But now, he could be. One evening, as they sat outside while the children played, he finally voiced the question that had been lingering on his mind. Do you regret it? She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Regret what? Not telling me sooner. Raising them alone. Keeping them from me. She sighed, folding her arms over her chest as she watched the children chase each other in the fading light. I regret that it had to be this way, she admitted. I regret that you never got to know them when they were babies. That they never knew their father. His throat tightened. But I don't regret choosing to protect them, she continued. I did what I thought was best. Maybe I was wrong, maybe I wasn't, but I did what I had to do at the time. He nodded, staring at the ground. He couldn't argue with that. She had done the impossible. She had raised two children with no support, no safety net, no guarantee of what the future would hold. And in doing so, she had given them a love so strong that even he, an outsider, could feel it. "I don't want to take them away from you," he said quietly. "I don't want to change what you've built." She turned to him, searching his face. "Then what do you want?" He swallowed hard. "A chance. A chance to be their father. To be whatever they need me to be." Silence stretched between them. The children's laughter echoed in the background, filling the space where words failed. Finally, she spoke. "Then prove it." His gaze snapped to hers. She smiled faintly. "I don't mean with money. Or grand gestures. Just show up. Be here. Be present. Because that's all they need from you. They don't care about what you've done or what you've built. They just want to know if you'll stay." The simplicity of it floored him. It wasn't about fixing the past. It wasn't about making up for lost time in a single moment. It was about consistency, about love, about the everyday presence that made a real father, not just a man who shared their blood. He nodded, determination settling in his chest. "I will." For the first time, she looked at him not with skepticism, but with something softer, something close to trust. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the CEO realized the greatest lesson he had ever learned had nothing to do with business, power, or success. It had nothing to do with deals or negotiations. It had to do with love. Real, unshakable, unconditional love. And in that moment, he knew, this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Final thoughts and life lesson. The story ends with a powerful, hopeful resolution. The CEO doesn't win back the woman or magically erase the past. Instead, he learns that love is not about grand gestures or making up for lost time, it's about being there. The final scene leaves viewers with a deep, emotional lesson. Life is not about what you build for yourself, it's about the relationships you choose to nurture. Love is not in words, it's in presence.